Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 29th of November of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And this video I would like to start with the report that was published by the Russian intelligence service, foreign intelligence service. They prepared very interesting article about possible future of Ukraine. Let's take a read at this article. The press bureau of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation reports that, according to information received by the intelligence service in the context of the obvious lack of the prospects of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia on the battlefield, NATO is increasingly inclined to the need to freeze the Ukrainian conflict. The West is considering the implementation of such scenario as an opportunity to restore the combat capabilities of the Ukraine armed forces and thoroughly prepare Kyiv for an attempt at revenge. NATO members are already deploying training centers in Ukraine through which they plan to drag at least 1 million mobilized Ukrainians. So when talking about million mobilized Ukrainians, I would like to remind you that according to information we have, the Western countries, the United States of America, United Kingdom, Germany, many NATO countries are forcing Ukrainians to reduce the mobilization age. Currently, the mobilization age was established on the age of 25 years old, and the Western countries are trying to force Ukrainians to reduce the age until 18. So most likely, when talking about this million of mobilized Ukrainians, the Russian intelligence service are talking about young boys after the school. Another important area of the alliance work during the ceasefire will be the restoration of Ukraine military-industrial complex. Active work is underway with Western military-industrial companies, including the German Rheinmetall, from which they are required not only to invest but also to send leading specialists and high-performance equipment to Ukraine. NATO headquarters understands that without providing the Ukrainian armed forces with the sufficient weapons and ammunition, the expectation that Ukrainians will be able to conduct high-intensity combat operations over a long period of time is unrealistic. To solve these problems, the West will need to actually occupy Ukraine. Naturally, this will be done under the guise of deploying a peacekeeping contingent in the country. The territories that are supposed to be distributed between the countries have been determined. Black Sea coast will go to Romania. So when talking about the Black Coast, we're talking about Odessa most likely, maybe Nikolaev, maybe the city of Kherson. Western regions of Ukraine, Poland. Center and east of the country to Germany. So Kharkiv most likely will be in the area of the Germans' responsibilities. Northern regions, including the capital, so Kyiv, will go to United Kingdom. In total, it is planned to introduce 100,000 so-called peacekeepers to Ukraine. So this is the plan of the Western countries about the freezing of the conflict according to the Russian intelligence services. And of course, the Russians will never accept this, because one of the most important paragraphs of this freezing of the conflict, there are going to be no papers signed between Russia and Ukraine, which means that the conflict will be indeed just freeze. So war will not be finished, peace agreement will not be signed, no Minsk agreements, no Stambul agreements, just the war will be finished, because Western countries will deploy their 100,000 soldiers along the line of combat contact, which of course will reduce the Russians' possibilities for offensive operations. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians and NATO countries, they're not given any guarantees that Ukraine, during this period of time, will not be trained and taught by the Western countries, by NATO officers. There is no guarantees to Russia that Western countries are not going to send money, send weapon, establish production of, weapon, and many other things. So this freezing of the conflicts, of course, tell us that most likely the Western countries are trying to stop the war at this stage, because they understand that at this stage they are not able to win this war. Maybe the Western countries want to resolve the issue with the president of Ukraine, because according to many sources, lots of people in the world doesn't recognize Zelensky as a real president of Ukraine, and so Western countries most likely want to conduct elections and maybe to solve some constitutional issues, not to get in the same situation in the future if the second war between Russia and Ukraine will take another 4 or 5 years. In this case, the Western countries need to be sure that, for example, the president will be elected not for 4 years, but for 10 years or something like this. Anyway, all these issues the Western countries are trying to solve, and they want to force the Russians to follow this agreement. And most likely, the Russians will never accept this. Because at the same time, when the Western countries began talking about this contingent of 100,000 people, the Russians began talking about Oreshnik. And the most important thing, that the Russians are planning to attack Ukraine on the 30th of November, according to Ukrainian sources, with military warhead. Not just like without warhead, but with a real warhead, and that this attack will deal the significant damage to Ukraine. For example, Putin stated that missile warhead reaches a temperature of 4,000 degrees Celsius, making it highly destructive. Anything in the blast zone is broken down into elementary particles, essentially turning it into dust. Another important thing that Ukrainians are saying, that at this time the Russian Federation will attack Ukraine with Oreshnik a little bit different way. First of all, they're going to use a real warhead, and the second thing, if you remember, when there was the first attack, Putin stated several times that the next time when the Russians are going to use Oreshnik with the military real warhead, Russia will tell Ukrainians, civilians, they will tell them that it's better not to be in this or that region, because we're going to attack this territory, let's say within the next 4 or 5 hours. So that's why it's better to evacuate people from this area. And according to Ukrainian sources, Putin himself is going to tell this information to Ukrainians. And so this is going to be something like a signal. If the Russians are going to attack with Oreshnik in Ukraine, let's say some Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, or let's say some political bloc in the country, and so on. First of all, Russians will warn Ukrainians about this upcoming strike, and Putin is going to make this statement personally. So this is according to Ukrainian sources. Anyway, sooner or later we're gonna see this, and we will understand whether the Russians are going to do this or not. Now let's move to the line of combat contact. We have lots of very interesting updates, and first let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. I'll remind you that a few days ago, the Russians entered the southeastern part of Velyka and Novosilka, but after that advance, the Russians stopped. For some reason, the Russians, for the previous several days, haven't managed to improve their positions even for a single square kilometer inside of the territory of Velyka and Novosilka. It's very difficult to understand what is happening. Maybe the Ukrainians managed to bring additional forces and reserves that managed to stabilize the situation. Maybe the Russians managed to take under control the southeastern part, and then they turned focus into some other areas, like the village of Rozdolne. As you can see, we have changes on the map in Russian favor based on many icons. This morning, first, we got the video that was published by the Russians of how the Russian artillerymen, servicemen, and Russian aviation were bombing and attacking first the town of Velyka and Novosilka, and in the second part of the video, how the Russians were bombing the village of Rozdolne. And in the morning, we got the first statements that the village was captured completely, but later, somewhere at 1 p.m. of the local time, of Ukrainian time, we got another article published by the 14th Guards Marine Brigade of the Armored Forces of Russian Federation. And in this video, we can see the building, and we see that the Russians raised the flag right exactly on the territory of the school. So this is exactly the building where the Russians raised the flag, and later we got another proof. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village of Rozdolne. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map completely in Russian favor. As you can see, this territory used to be considered as a contested zone. Now we have no doubts that the Russians control the territory completely. We have just one question: whether the Russians managed to establish complete control over the company stronghold that located to the west of Rozdolne. And as I understand, the stronghold still remains under complete Ukrainian control. And as for the next several days, this is the primary target for the Russians. First, the Russians need to cut the road 0518 between Velyka and Novosilka and the village of Bogatyr. After the fall of the stronghold, the Russians will be able to begin their offensive operation in the direction of the village by the name of Novokamar, because the stronghold to the north in this case is going to be something like Russian northern flank, hand, the Russian will be able to move in the direction of Novokamar without any resistance. And after fall of the village of Novokamar and the Rozdolne, the company stronghold, then the Russians will be able to semi-encircle Velyka Novosilka from the southeast, east, northeast, and the north. And most likely, exactly at this period of time, the Russians will resume their offensive operation on the line between Rovnopol and the road 0510, with the purpose to cut another supply road that goes from Velyka Novosilka in the direction of Gulay-Polya. And from this perspective, this is going to be the end of the story of Velyka Novosilka, and either the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back or they would be caught in cauldron. So just probably a week or maybe 2 weeks to complete the encirclement operation of the town of Velyka Novosilka. Now let's talk about another important progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation. Today, pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions between the Velyka Novosilka stronghold and the Uspenovka stronghold. So as you can see, this is the changes on map that were provided us by pro-Ukrainian sources, and we see that the Russians continue improving their positions, and most likely during the next several days the Russians will try to attack the villages of Razliv and the village of Constantinople. And if the Russians are able to complete this offensive successfully, this could lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense with unpredictable consequences for the armed forces of Ukraine that are currently located on the territory of Uspenovka stronghold and the city of Kurakhove itself. As for the Uspenovka stronghold, during the previous 24 hours we got lots of updates. We got the videos from the villages of Elizavetovka and Ilinka. In this video, for example, we can see how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian positions, how the Russians were cleaning up the territory of the village. And telling the truth, I believe that both villages of Elizavetovka and Ilinka were appeared in cauldron. You know that most likely the Russians managed to cut both villages from the mainland, and now the Russians are trying to secure the territory, while another group of Russian forces managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt from the village of Bagayavlenka along the Lisova Dacha and to enter the southern outskirts of the village of Veselый Gай. So this is something that we've been receiving for the previous 24 hours. From one side, the Russians managed to enter the village of Veselый Gai according to different mappers and according to different sources on the ground. On the other side, we haven't received any updates that the Russians managed to secure the village of Elizavetovka and Ilinka completely. On the other hand, we continue receiving updates of how the Russians were bombing, attacking, and FPV droning the Ukrainian positions on the territory of this agglomeration. So most likely this is the situation. The Ukrainians officially were caught in cauldron on the territory of these two villages. But I'll remind it, according to different mappers, these three villages, including Romanovka, were captured by the Russians during the previous week. Now let's talk about the city of Kurakhove. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. The village of Berestki, we got information from pro-Ukrainian sources that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to take under control company stronghold in the northwestern part of the village. So now there are no barriers in front of the Russians to move further in the direction of the village by the name of Stary Terny. So during the next several days, we're going to start receiving first updates of clashes for this stronghold. But this is going to be a very difficult operation for the Russians. Most likely this is going to be the most difficult battle for the Russians since the beginning of the battle for Kurakhove. And I'm telling you this because, once again, let's take a look at this video. And in this video and this episode, we can see the number of strongholds and trenches and the fortifications that were created by the Ukrainians. And all this region from the Kurakhove water reservoir and further in the western direction looks like this. The significant number of trenches that the Russians are forced to attack with the purpose to close, with the purpose to caught the Ukrainians in cauldron on the territory of city of Kurakhove. So very difficult, very complicated situation, but the Russians have no other option, and most likely they will begin this offensive or the first attempts in the very near future. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the city of Pokrovsk. We have a lot of changes on the ground. Today, different mappers reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions along the railways, and the Russians managed to shorten the lines between the village of Petrikovka and the village of Shevchenko for another several kilometers. And we got another update that the Russians improved their positions to the west of Novogrodovka by taking additional fields. Now we see that from these two icons, from these two updates, we see that the main purpose of the Russians on this stage of the special military operation is to take everything under control inside of this red line. You know that today I analyzed a lot the situation in this area, and I see that when talking about this direction, the Russians were always advancing just along the railways. And first the Russians were advancing along the railways, and then the Russians were improving their positions to the right and to the left side of the railways. And when talking about this case, we see that the railways are moving further. And if we take a look at the map, after the village of Novotrud and Shevchenka, the railways are going in the southeastern part of the city by the name of Pokrovsk. So this is it. And this is very interesting because if the Russians are going to continue moving further in the northeastern direction with the purpose to take under control this part of Pokrovsk, and telling the truth, I see no barriers that can stop the Russians to do this, then this is going to be a complete disaster for the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians from this perspective, from this configuration, on the territory of the city of Mirnograd and further in the southern direction would be completely cut from supply and support. And this offensive operation along the railways will allow the Russians from Grodovka to begin offensive operation in the direction of the southern part of Mirnograd. So telling the truth, I see this as the next step, the next Russian task in the battle for the city of Pokrovsk. While one group of forces is going to move along the railways, and the main purpose is to get exactly on the territory of this intersection of the railways, roads between Pokrovsk in Mirnograd, and as soon as when the Russians are able to create a stable foothold exactly in this point, another Russian group of forces will begin assault operation in the direction of the southern part of Mirnograd. And the task, and according to my understanding, according to timings, this operation should be finished by the Russians, maybe even by the beginning of January, somewhere in the first decade of January of 2025. If the Russians are able to do this, this is going to be the significant damage to Ukraine when talking about as a media victory. Now let's move further. Another important thing, the Russians managed to enter the village of Pushkina. So we discussed this operation several days ago during the previous several videos. The Russians are heading towards this agglomeration of villages, and once again, if the Russians are able to take these villages under complete control, then the Russians will be able to establish complete fire FPV drone control over the significant number of territories, and the Russians will be able to enter the Dnipro region. So let's wait, and most likely something big is going to happen here in the South Donetsk direction. The situation indeed is very critical, and I'm not sure how the Ukrainians are going to save the situation. Now let's move further. As for the Torietsk direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special. As for the city of Chasivyar, the same story. The southern Kupiansk direction, also nothing special, just additional changes on the ground on the village of Terny. The Russian sources published the video, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian forces and how the Ukrainians were trying to slow the Russians down. One of the episodes of FPV drone attack took place exactly on the territory of these farms. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. So the Russians are moving, and there are just 2 streets or 3 streets left when the Russians are able to take the village of Terny under complete control. As for the northern Kupiansk direction, today we got several reports from pro-Russian sources about additional changes on the ground to the south of the village by the name of Kurakhove. This morning, first we got report that the Russians managed to take under control up to 10 buildings of the village by the name of Zagryzove. And later, right before we start making the video, we got another report that the Russians managed to the advance in the 24 hours is up to 500 meters deep and up to a kilometer along the front. So the Russians are moving. I'll just remind you that during the November, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west of Vishnyovo in the direction of Zelený Gai. Summarizing everything, we can see that the final point of both directions is the village of Novoplatonovka. By these attacks, the Russians are planning to cut the village, the city or the town of Barova from the central, from the southern Kupiansk direction to block the village and then to continue doing something in this area. As for the Sudzha direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got unconfirmed reports that the Russians managed to enter the territory of Martinovka. The Russians, that was stated by official Telegram channel of the Group of Forces North. Currently, we don't have no proofs that can confirm this, but if this information is correct, I believe that during the next several days, either we're going to receive the video with the flag or the map changes from reliable resources. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.